call to worship is responsive this morning. Sometimes we are stuck in mud, stuck in our own ways, sloughing blindly with shoulders bent, heads low. In Jesus Christ, there is a new creation.
Everything old has passed away. Everything has become new.
This newness is from God, who has reconciled us through Jesus Christ, who has turned the mud into a greener path.
Rejoice and be glad. Everything has become new. Thank you, God.
Please rise if you are able, in body or in spirit, and join. You have to pick up a hymnal, sorry. Join us in the midst of new dimensions, verses 1 and 3. So the next part is a litany inspired by Psalm number 118. And you'll notice in the first line that eternal is ostracized. Is that a word? But at the bottom, you'll see the definite or the reason for that. I was looking for a gender-neutral term other than Lord. We have used Lord forever, okay? So I went to the rabbi in Hazleton, Rabbi Joseph Zeiberber, and asked him, are there any Hebrew Bible translations of the word, is it Adonai? No, Elohim. Elohim. And so he took off. He, researches his thing. He was really good. And he came up with the recent, it's 2007, publication of the New Jewish Publication Scriptures. And they translated Elohim as eternal. As eternal. That really hit home for me. I mean, I really thought of, can we use lady, Lord? No, that doesn't make any sense. I don't even like that at all. So I really like eternal, and that's what I've been trying to use. I throw Lord in once in a while, but not all the time. I just like that, the eternal. So that's why we're using that. And with that, we're using all the pronouns, she, he, they, because God is the perfect human in all of our identities.
May this day bring Sabbath rest to our hearts and homes.
May God's image in each of us be restored and our imaginations be restored.
May the gravity of material things be lightened and the relativity of time slow down.
May we know grace to embrace our own finite smallness in the arms of God's infinite greatness.
And may God's word feed us and the Spirit lead us into the day and into the life to come.
Let all the people say amen.
Amen.
When we were thinking about doing Ministry Day, one of the things that our community of practice, which is those of you those that you see around the table, we don't need these anymore?
No, it's left on, almost left on.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Basically, we've been looking at death and dying of the churches and what we can do, and for how many years now? 4, 5? So when it came time to, Bonnie was looking for folks to do something for Ministry Day, I approached her and said, could we do something? Because I think there's some wisdom in the studies that we have done. And so these next couple of skits that we have for you are real life situations, and I'm thinking you could probably find yourself in them. But in the midst of them, we also have some, hopefully, nuggets of wisdom, and hopefully to get you thinking about your own churches. So we're going to start with our first skit. Turn this off. All right. Just stand up. Just me.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for coming this evening. Greatly appreciate it, and thank you for responding to my need for help. I'm going to...
Oh, Pastor Lou, you're not telling us you're leaving, are you?
No, Bonnie, I'm not leaving. Nothing like that. I just need some help within the church. I propose we choose maybe 5 people from our congregation to visit 5 of our church members, be they homebound or in a personal care situation or hospitalized, and especially those we haven't seen for a while.
Well, we've never done this before. I don't see it working. Most of the people in our congregation are old. No one helps anymore. Look what happened at our dinners.
Oh, yeah, I agree. I'm exhausted from the consistory meetings and gathering the flowers from the altar. And, even though I'm retired and in perfect health, I'm just tired.
Well, I do know that other churches within the Penn Northeast Conference have done this. I would like to use them as a model.
Well, you said about other churches doing this, but does it work?
Well, I do know it did work for some churches and not in others.
Well, now, Lou, you do know what the definition of insanity is, right?
I do. Trying something new over and over again, expecting different results.
Oh, yeah, like the Easter egg hunt, when we, paint 12 dozen eggs and then only 2 kids show up, like that.
That's true.
So, I gotta ask the question, how much is this gonna cost?
Well, hopefully nothing much, but the return to our church will be significant. This is something new for us. You're all familiar with Ecclesiastes, the 3rd chapter.
The funeral one.
It states to everything there is a season and a time to every purpose under heaven.
Well, we've been through a lot of seasons in this church.
Steve, this is true. All of you have been very faithful members of this church and have worked very hard. I believe that we're in a new season. Ecclesiastes continues, a time to be born and a time to die. It's a great description of what we are facing right now.
I'm not sure this describes us at all.
Well, listen, Steve, a time to be born, and a time to die. Life and death, everything. People, animals, plants, and even businesses. The church have a birth, a life, and a death. Actually, it's a bell curve.
I was thinking about that old barber shop that went out of business last year. I gotta run all the way to Scottstown now to get my hair cut.
What hair?
Well, yeah, but remember the mom and pop's grocery stores? Oh, you remember Doris Fletcher? Her parents ran one.
Oh, I love that store.
I know, me too.
I know.
Well, good, this is good. Now let's apply that thought to the church. Every organization, including the church, goes through that same pattern of birth, life, death. What do you think our church is on this continuum? Where do you think we are on this bell curve?
Well, it's true, all right. I mean, everybody talks about our church from, back in the 60s and 70s with all the kids running all over the place and all those youth group activities. Not anymore.
I'm sorry, I still don't get it. How is visiting people going to make a difference?
Well, I actually had the same question as Bonnie did. It's scary stuff.
I find it a bit nerve-wracking, to tell you the truth.
And how are we going to learn to do this? We're not ministers, and remember, I can't help, I'm busy.
I assure all of you that I have colleagues within the Penn Northeast Conference that can help.
Well, okay, so let me get this. So you have this hope that the people that we send out for visitation will be able to help in this process that Ecclesiastes talks about.
I do know my mother only wants to see the minister.
Yeah, mine too.
Well, the people being visited may open up to the members of the congregation in ways that they wouldn't do for the minister.
I still don't quite get it. Can you explain what you mean?
Well, sure. So perhaps, they could engage in a conversation of maybe how they came to St. Paul's, or what you like best about the church, and what would you change? Remember Ecclesiastes, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing.
I get that, Pastor, I think. That's great, really. I wish somebody would ask me those questions. I do a lot around here.
You do, Bonnie, you do. We all know that. And my hope is we could make new connections with some of the folks we haven't seen in a while. Gather stones.
I'm gonna get a little bit excited about this. It may work.
Well, I have a list of church members that I hope would be willing to participate. Our first step is to get them interested. I already took the initiative of scheduling our first visitation class for next Thursday at 7 p.m.
We'll pray.
I don't know where I am on mine.
All right, folks, come on, let's settle down. I gotta get this done. Somebody took my gavel again, so I have to use this. All right.
Dave, sorry, it's getting harder and harder to keep this place going. The property just, everything comes up, it's up, constant. And every time we turn around, there's just something else breaking down.
Yeah, and I feel as creaky as the pew I fixed last week.
None of us are getting any younger. We're the young people.
I asked my grandson to help me service our lawn tractor to get ready for winter, and he came by to actually help.
I just read on the internet the other day that Generation Y and Generation Z are not nearly as big numbers as our generation. So the plain fact is there aren't as many young folk in the U.S. anymore.
Well, that's a great point, Dale.
Well, it may be a reality, but how do we keep the church going then?
Hey, Dave, you had asked me to look into how much money we've spent on our church building and property in the last 10 years.
That's you, Dave.
Well,
That's right.
all right. How did that go, and what'd you find out?
Well, I have it here. Anyone want to guess?
10,000? Well,
25?
25?
18,000.
99,000.
Well, I'm sorry. Nope, you're all wrong. $225,637.
On property?
On property?
And guess what? That doesn't include replacing the boiler or the roof we replaced 5 years ago.
Wow. Oh,
Wow. I mean, I knew it was going to be a lot, but holy moly.
yeah.
I know we need a building, but at what cost? If we count up all the pumpkin rolls we sold, raisin-filled cookies we've made, and the quarts of chicken pot pie we made monthly, oh my God.
And what if we would have even put half of that into the mission needs of our church?
Well, we have to keep the doors open.
But is this ministry? Can we really call this ministry?
Well, I think we all agree that we definitely need to do something different. So let's all go to the next consistory meeting and start thinking and dreaming about church maybe a little differently. I mean, do we even need this place?
No, it sounds like a plan, but you know what Chester is going to say.
Over my dead body.
Oh.
Because we pay her to pray.
Okay.
Why don't we pray?
Well, I remember as a young girl, always in school, every day with prayer, and feel they never should have taken prayer out of the school.
Nope. But we aren't in school anymore, and school don't pray.
Well, I don't know. Couldn't we start a prayer circle? I mean, a group that we could contact and we could call on them to pray for our church, our consistory, our concerns, and anyone could call on them to ask for specific prayer, you know, for members and non-members.
That's a great idea, Dave. We're going to walk with that one. Oh, how about a grandparents' day for worship? Oh, we can invite everyone to bring their grandchildren or any child in the neighborhood. They can get into the church. We can pair them up with another person to pray, including the grandteens and grandchildren. And there must be, there's just something about children praying for adults that just touches my heart.
Well, that might bring some young people back.
Well, the goal is to pray, not to reel them in.
Well, you know, Jesus did say that Peter and Andrew can catch people. And that's what we do here. We catch people and hold them in prayer. That's what we're doing as a church, so they don't fall.
Well, at least it won't cost anything.
True.
You know, all this talk about the past and looking for creative ideas moving forward kind of reminds me of a story I read in Michael Gerlhouse's book on grief and loss and how it is explained. Can you tell that story, Dale?
Sure thing. There were three old farmers who sat on the front porch looking out over the sea of corn and soybeans that were turning from green to a golden brown. They were living in South Dakota. Their crops were just starting to turn. The first farmer said, "I remember when there was a family living on just about every section." The second farmer added, "I remember riding on my dad on the old tractor in the open weather, little rain. Didn't matter. He was out there working." And the third farmer added, "I remember a lot of dust."
As we remember the past and grieve those empty places in our lives or in the church, we can either get trapped in the memories as we yearn for that which is gone, or we can use those memories to build the continuing bonds that can carry us into the future.
Well, I think that's really great food for thought. I mean, what did you preach on last week? The sermon was a Kairos moment? A Kairos time.
Somebody
A Kairos
remembers.
time. Well, maybe now is the time to use past memories to build continuing bonds that will carry us forward.
Hey, remember that quote from Michael Gerhouse's book? Dale, can you share that with us? Can you read it?
Nostalgia and yearning are often thought to be synonymous terms, that remembering the past, but increasingly we are learning that they are not. Just as we are learning that grief is not about relinquishing emotional attachments to that which we've lost, we are also learning that nostalgia can actually contribute to building the continuing bonds and inner representations that we carry with us into the future. While yearning ties us to the past and can lead us to our becoming stuck in our grief, nostalgia can open us up to that great cloud of witnesses that the Hebrew writer declares to help us draw an example as we contemplate our future.
Well, thanks for all of that. I think that we did some really good work tonight. I make a motion to adjourn.
And I second that.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Meeting adjourned.
And I'm thankful to be there. I'm thankful for the invitation. I do want to say there was a lot of acting ability up here today. They really were quite extraordinary. And in fact, I want to announce that they will be doing a senior version of Grease next month. And I invite you all to it, right? There we go. So I am called to sort of talk about assessment tools, but I want to talk about what's really happening in the church in general, okay? And I think we all know this, but I think it's important to say it. One of the things I do all the time with our churches, in fact, I'm doing one this Saturday, is to talk about the issue of sharing a pastor. It's something that a lot of our churches, at least 20 years ago, from what I heard, really resisted the idea of that. They felt like the conference was forcing the issue on them. They didn't see the need for it. And what I'm seeing now, I had to tell my conference minister, I'm not seeing that resistance. I'm seeing a lot of people saying, okay, I think we're ready. I think this is something we can consider. And that is a piece of good news. Now, how we got there is another set of issues. So I was at General Synod this last summer, and of course you go to General Synod, they have that wonderful Pilgrim Press bookstore, and they sell all the current stuff, bought a lot of the current stuff. But there was also, There was also a chance for us to buy some of the older books, stuff that they had sort of had, and of course were no longer in print. And I picked up a book called Too Many Pastors, published in 1980. Closer to it? All right. Thank you. And I thought, how ironic. So I, of course, had to pick it up. It was, well, free. So that was really nice. But I thought, how interesting that in 1978, the concern of people looking at developments in church work was there was going to be too many pastors and not enough churches. And one of the things that, of course, I'm dealing with right now, and I suspect you guys are as well, perhaps not, but I think overall it sort of reflects what's going on in Christendom, at least among mainstream churches, is that I find that it is hard to get churches to apply for positions, pastors to apply for positions, not simply because they don't want to, but because we're just not enough of us out there doing this work. When I was at my church in Chicago and I applied there in 2011, they told me they received 88 profiles. Now, it's north side of Chicago, wonderful neighborhood, great congregation, had kind of done a turnaround, really good congregation. When I left in 2022, January of 2022, I thought, well, they're going to be lucky maybe to get 25 profiles. They just called someone, a really talented minister, and I was listening to the report back from the search team online, and they mentioned that they had only received 14 profiles. I thought, 14 profiles, how is that possible? And I was actually pretty stunned by that, but it is what it is at this point. So in the Pennsylvania Southeast Conference, for those of you who don't know, one of the things I often mention is that 58% of our churches are now served by part-time pastors. They may not be doing part-time ministry, but they're being served by part-time pastors. In 2018, we had 22 members in discernment. Now we have 10. In 2018, a church of a certain size, maybe 50 to 100 attendance, met conference guidelines, kind of the best we can offer in many ways. Our church, our denomination has historically been a denomination of smaller churches compared to other denominations. In 2018, they would have received, on average, about 16 profiles. In 2022, they received 9. Some in really good positions maybe received 4 or 5. So the reality is that there's not enough us good souls serving churches out there, and there are not enough church who can afford us in many ways if they're not willing to be creative. And of course, the lack of pastors reflects that numerical decline across American Christianity. And again, it is American Christianity. There are parts of the world in which, of course, Christianity is booming. And also, I think one of the things that we didn't realize as 20 or 25 years ago, we were grieving sort of our decline in the mainline traditions, the Lutherans or the ELCA, the UCC, the Presbyterian USA, is that in fact, we were the first wave of this numerical decline. Not spiritual decline, numerical decline. And in fact, let me tell you, I come from a Southern Baptist tradition. In fact, I grew up secular, but became a Christian at 13, became Southern Baptist because I asked my secular parents, what are we? They said, I think we're Southern Baptist. I said, well, take me to a Southern Baptist church. So I got saved at 13 and was in the midst of the 80s and 90s when Southern Baptists were just booming. They're the largest Protestant denomination in this country. They are in the sort of the fastest growing region in the country. And up until the mid-2000s, they were really growing. Well, 2006, for the first time, there was a numerical decline within Southern Baptist circles. And since 2006, there has been a loss of something like 2.5 to 3 million members of the Southern Baptist tradition, which is stunning to me because one of the things they always prided themselves on was, you know, if you liberal mainliners preach the real gospel of Jesus Christ, you wouldn't be in decline, but we've got the pure one. And of course, the reality is that they're experiencing that wave as well. Something like 20 years ago, evangelicals, Christians, were about 20% of the population. We were down to about 13%. Right now, they've declined around our size. So both of us roughly share about 13 to 14% of the population in terms of numerical percentage of those who are active in Christianity. Of course, mega churches, right? That church that I was a member of, or was one of the 8 associate pastors of, we were running about 2,100 in attendance. Now it's running about 1,300. Nothing to sneeze at, I know, but it is not the same as it was those many years ago when we literally had lines going out the door to get into the sanctuary. Mega churches are still, in many ways, maybe the growing edge in terms of numbers. The problem is, as Scott Thuma has pointed out in some of his work, he was a professor of mine when I was a student in seminary, you know, they have stalled to some degree, and they're not growing as quickly. They offer what many of us cannot offer, which is big youth groups and big, you know, children's programs. But the reality is that the sort of the demographics of the nuns, those of us who, like most of my friends, frankly, who have left Christianity and said, it's just not for me. And they have been affected by that as well. We can't pretend that it's not. And there's obviously demographic changes going on, movement into the cities, depopulation of the very area that we were strongest in, which is in more rural areas on the outer skirts of bigger cities. But one of the things I often want to point out to smaller churches as I'm talking about sharing a pastor is the reality is that this last 125 years has actually been the anomaly. This idea that you could have one solo pastor assigned to one church and he or she, mostly he in the 19th century, probably overwhelmingly he, was basically able to serve that church and make a living, right? But in fact, the 19th, 18th centuries, most pastors actually serve multiple congregations. So when I talk about sharing a pastor nowadays, I just remind them we're just going back. Not backwards, just back, right? To really the mean, rather than what was this weird sort of growth in church work and church attendance that happened at post-World War II. We were building, we all know these stories. We were building for buildings in which we thought the children would never stop coming. But I'm going to argue, and I will argue, that we matter. Of course, the church matters. I have no faith that the church is ever going away. The good news of the gospel is the good news of the gospel forever. All right? I have no doubt about that. How we do church is going to be different, no doubt, right? But I do think one of the things that I think, there are a couple of things that I think are really important. Number one, just as in this weird political environment, which is weird to bring up politics right now, is that it's interesting that as I go into our churches and I get a chance to kind of visit a lot of churches, because obviously I'm not tied to one particular congregation, though I am a member at St. Peter's Pikeland in Chester Springs. I'm visiting churches all the time, Pastor Bonnie as well. And I'm often surprised and the wonder of it. There's so much ministry still going on out there, right? All the woe and there's folks being loved, folks being fed, folks doing things in the world in the name of Jesus Christ. But on a political level, I would say this: we matter, especially in the mainstream churches, because we're one of the few places that is actually purple anymore, right? There are not a lot of places anymore in which we do not divide ourselves between Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal. And you go into our churches, and it's so stunning to realize that finally there's a place where people who disagree vehemently on some issues, on who they voted for, somehow get together and worship in this very divided nation. If I went to the local evangelical church, there's a good chance that's not going to be the case. Everybody's going to probably be on the same side when it comes to who they voted for. But that's not the case in most of our churches, right? There's real political diversity. And God knows we need to be able to talk to each other. We need to love each other. We need to remind each other that though we may disagree politically, we can still love each other and serve each other and be there for each other. Okay? That's on one level that's important. The other greater, broader level, I would say that we matter, the church matters on a broader stage is, and I have argued this and I'll say it till my last breath. The church is the one place in the world where we're asked to do one fundamental thing, and that is to learn how to love. To learn how to love God and to learn how to love each other. Kiwanis are great. The Rotary is great. They're great clubs. They do great things in the world. But they don't gather to learn how to love each other. They sometimes gather to serve each other and serve the community. But the church is that one place where we gather to learn how to love God and do the difficult task of learning how to love each other when we don't agree with each other. It's the most miraculous place. And people show up to do that very thing. They don't sometimes realize they show up to do that, but they do that. And so I hope you hear, at least from me, and I hope you hear from the Spirit, that what we do in the world really matters, okay? But the world is changing. The way we do church is different. The church may matter, but we're having to do it with less people. We have less financial resources. We need to assess, of course, on basis of that, where we are in terms of a cycle when it comes to life and death. And one of the things I often say to churches when I'm presenting this workshop, because one of the things I talk about when I talk about sharing a pastor, or when we talk about our legacy workshop, is the reality, here are some options in terms of where you're at. And I think it's really important for you as a congregation, or leaders of a congregation, pastors of a congregation, to remind people, you have choices here. You can make a decision about where you are. You can try a new thing, right? But one of the things I really think of is just to remind them, in the midst of that choices, which I will talk about in a second, death is one of those choices. Not the one we want to make, but I think in the cycle of life and death, we got to make sure that we realize that, it's okay to breathe in and breathe out and say the work is done. But that's the last choice, right? There's a lot of things to do in between, but I think it's important to think it out. So I'm going to ask somebody to do the one sheet Sue, are you the person with that one sheet? It's just a one sheet assessment. There are certainly more rigorous ones out there that are better than mine, but this one was actually developed by the Southern New England Conference. It shows you what you can do with a lot of money and a lot of staff folks. They have a Center for Transformational Leadership. There's a lot of material on that sheet that is very useful. It is open and can be used by any of us. It's really good. Pastor Heather, who's the charge of that, is a good friend of mine, and she shared this with me as well as some other materials. But I wanted to look at actually the cycle we're talking about here. Let's see. There was a mention of that church life cycle. I'll wait till everybody gets some. Can I also say, this is one of the most well-lit sanctuaries I've ever seen. I was looking at the video screen and the way the light comes up, and it's like, wow, somebody thought this out. So well done, well done. All right, what you're going to get, of course, is the church life cycle sheet. You've probably seen this before, but I think it's a really good basic thing, and it asks 3 or 4 really fundamental questions. One of them, of course, is the cycle itself. I actually like the one on the back of it a little bit better, but I'm going to actually point to that one real quick. If you'll look on the back, and it says that it's the black and white version of it. Oh, no problem. Thank you, Sue. Sue and I were trying to figure out where we knew each other. We figured out we were at the clergy convocation, so together. It's a good gathering of folks, fellow clergy, if you ever get a chance to join us there. So on the back there, you do see that the black and white version on page 2 of it, not the color side. You see, I think, a more useful sort of look at this, at least at the beginning, in terms of this. We obviously, all churches begin. I was blessed enough to help start a new church in Oklahoma City. There's the launch, there's excitement. Hopefully there's some growth, and we did have some of that as well. There's also thinking about how we're growing, and then there is sustained health. I think one of the things I often say especially launching a new church, one of the things we made a mistake of in Oklahoma City was the pastor wasn't there for that 7-10 years that needs to be a part of that first church start. I was transferred somewhere else. There were some things going on in the national or the larger church in Dallas. But one of the mistakes we made was that lack of stability at the very beginning. So where are we with this? So there's sustained health, and then some of us are probably not anywhere near launch. We're in the midst of hopefully sustained health. We've been around for a while. It's stunning to me some of the ages of our church. But some of us are probably on the other side too. We're dealing with maintenance. We're dealing with the creation of programs to sustain our ministry. And then we sometimes slide into preservation, which is now we're just trying to preserve what has been a part of the past. And then we come to ourselves to a place near life support, where we're really asking the questions, are we sustainable for the long run? If you'll turn to the other side really quickly, I want to say these key questions I think are really, this is a very simple evaluation, which is really, I think, powerful. Where are we now? On this bell curve as a congregation, where are we? Asking one's congregation, where do you think we are on this? And the second question is, where do you think we're going? Asking that hard question as well, having the small groups for that. And where's God calling us? And one of the things I do want to say that, again, you can be a small church and be very healthy. I have pastored healthy, small congregations who were lucky to have somebody show up once every 3 weeks that was not already a member of that congregation, right? And it felt like a celebration that somebody would show up, right? So I get that. But where is God calling us now? What are we called to do? And some of the questions that I often say around sharing a pastor is that I often think people think, well, this will keep us alive. We'll share a pastor and that'll keep us alive. And I say to those churches, this is not the reason why to share a pastor. You share a pastor because there's more ministry to do. Not just so you can continue to be the chapel for the 10 families of that congregation. If there's more ministry to do, let's think about sharing a pastor. You have less resources. A lot of churches have less resources, but there can still be ministry done. There are a lot of resources here on the bottom in terms of things I would point you to. And one of the things that I would say when you go back and ask the fundamental question of what is our ministry, right? On the questions to bring back to your church on the back, what are your values? Who are you serving? And I'll be honest with you, I'm not one of those folks who think that saying, well, we are here for folks, we are for our folks. And I'm a little scared when we say, we put a dichotomy of, if you're not outward focused only, then you're not really doing ministry. Because in an age of loneliness, the fact that people gather once a week and they find themselves left alone can sometimes be ministry, right? And I want to vouch for that. But it cannot just be about the 10, 15, 35 people in the pews. It really needs to be also those outside the door, whether it's seeking them to come in or serving them in some way, or both, of course. As long as there's that nice balance, because you got to take, I used to say to new pastors or members in the sermon when I pastor them is, as long as you take care of the temple, there will be a chance for you to be a prophet. But you got to take care of the inside so you can do the work outside. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. Because they're going to remember when you weren't visited. Mom wasn't visited, but now you're calling them to do something daring, right? So it's really important to have that balance. Who are you serving? Do you have an internal focus, current members and structures? And I'm going to say it's okay to have some of that. Or an external focus, or. You should have both. Who is involved with the ministry of your church? Members, participants, neighbors from the surrounding area, community partners. And I want to say something that I think the UCC has done well on the national setting. As we're getting more of those, when we report back to the denomination, one of the things they've done recently is ask us, who are we affecting in our communities? Right? And one of the things that happened in my last church is we had a welcome meal. We call it the welcome meal on Wednesday nights. And we had homeless folks, people who just need an extra meal. Every night they would every Wednesday night they get a hot meal. 60 to 70 of folks showed up. Our folks were serving it. We had volunteers from the outside community. And those, in many ways, as somebody who was there every time serving and just being with homeless folks, being there with folks who are in need, they were part of my parish. You know this. Right? You find yourself in places in which there are people that I pastor to, that I am a pastor to, maybe the only pastor they have. When they came on Wednesday night and we prayed and they knew they could come back and say, Pastor, I need you to pray with me. And so it's really important that we count those folks as part of what we do in this world. Capacity questions. What are we able to do? Financial capacity. How are our finances? Goodness gracious, that's a huge thing. If there are concerns about the finances, what is the projected timeline for the current funding? People capacity. And this I don't think is asked enough, though we grouch about it all the time, right? There are just not enough people. And Bob keeps serving on consistory because there's no one else but Bob to be able to serve on consistory. Nobody wants to pick up the mantle. Nobody wants to do the ministry. If there is problems with people capacity, two things got to happen. People got to step up, or we're going to just wear each other out. Change capacity. Is this place, these people, able to change? Can we do some new thing? Can we even consider sharing a pastor or merger? Health, energy capacity. Is the relationship between your pastor and leadership strong and healthy? Is there a flow to how the congregation worship works and plays together? Is there a conflict? If so, how would you describe it? Is it misunderstanding, tension, strong disagreements, subtle conflict, or intense conflict with factions? Again, I love this for its simplicity, but I think another really great tool I will point out to you is what you received this morning, which is this wonderful, the marks of faithful expression of a local church based on the marks. And I think this is also another way to quantify. If you're a numbers person, and a lot of us are, this is a really great tool to really be able to work with your congregation about where we are. It's in your packet. It's available. I actually have some extra copies as well if you want to take it back. I know that it'll probably, if you need extra copies, it can be, I know Bonnie and them. It was put together by Pastor Bonnie and Carrie Call and my predecessor, Sharon Morris, as well as Nora Faust. It really is really good. If we can walk through it, again, it's centered around examining spiritual foundation, ongoing spiritual practices, nurturing UCC identity, building transformational leadership skills, engaging sacred stories and traditions, caring for all creation, participating in theological practice, encountering the other with justice and mercy, and strengthening interpersonal and intrapersonal assets. So these are ways that you can have those conversations in your own setting and engage with folks around this. And I will say, one of the things you need to know is my first church was in Spokane, Washington. It was a part-time position. I served there, and I also worked 2 other jobs. So I've also worked as a part-time pastor, or a tent maker, as we used to say, right? And that church is no longer here. They closed in the mid-aughts. One of the great heartbreaks of my life is that Emmanuel Church is no longer here. A lot of good memories. They made some mistakes later on. Things happened. I think sometimes we don't sort of tend to the grief of that possibility. I tend to it every time I think of them, and I think of some of the good people that are still around from that congregation. But I think the other side of it for us pastors is I think there's this fear, and it would have been my fear if I had been in the place while they were there, that I will end up being the pastor that has to help this church end its ministry. And I don't know about you, but I was trained in a model in which the measure of a pastor is how many people show up on a Sunday. In fact, I worked under a guy who basically said, either you're growing or you're dead. And I, over the years, come to realize that's BS, and I say that in Christian love. But that's how I measured myself for a long time. And I have pastored congregations that grew numerically, hopefully always spiritually, but I don't know, you'd have to ask them about that. And I have certainly pastored congregations where there were less and less people in the pews every Sunday. And I sat there kind of measuring myself against who shows up on Sunday. And the folks, when times were growing, felt great. When we were not, it felt like I was a personal failure. Like somehow I could have done something, should have done something, been more clever in programming, been able to pull them this way or that way. Let that go. There are forces in this culture that are out of people's control, out of our control. We are not failures because our churches don't grow, right? There are less people around. There are just less people around in the places that we have our strongest. And my own home church, St. Peter's Pikeland, wonderful church, but I go in there and I'm one of the youngest people there. I'm 54. And one of the things that struck me is that one of the leaders of the congregation contacted me as in my role as the ACM and was talking, we got to get the young families in, And what is that? It's been 50 years since everybody's been saying that. There are less young families going to church, folks, period. Just period. And I said to him, look, and you can do that. You can build on that model of, we grow because we have 20 young families with 6 kids apiece. Or you can look around and say, who's here? If it's seniors, what are we doing for senior ministry? Right? I mean, we can't sustain models in which we want to build out a big Sunday school. I'm not saying give up on Sunday school. Please don't get me wrong. But also, we haven't had a Sunday school since the pandemic. So, okay, here are the folks who are showing up. Are there ways of developing ministry that's geared towards the people who are in the neighborhood, which are older folks, not younger folks, especially in that neighborhood? So what I want to do is I'm trying to do the work of releasing myself from the burden of having to take on all the blame for church, because I was taught that. That was the model that was given to me. I'm a failure if we don't grow. In fact, when our new church started, we had about 72 in attendance to begin with. We grew to about 110, but I was told it wasn't fast enough within 2 years. So we need to move on. We need somebody who's going to be more dynamic than me. And it's in my head, my friends. It's my head. It was a lie. It's a lie. We were at the cusp of we didn't know where we were at in terms of church growth. So what I'm saying to you is work with your congregation. Find some ways to have some hard conversations around that and remind them there are ways to be faithful from the beginning to the end. Because as I've often said, and I have to think of this, especially in those moments when I felt like I was a failure, I've had to sort of say, look, I know on the great getting up morning, For those of you from more conservative evangelical traditions, that great getting up morning, the day of resurrection, when I must go before my Lord, God's not going to ask me, did your church grow? Did it decline? God's going to ask me, was I faithful to the gospel as it was given to me and to the people that were entrusted to me? That's what we're going to be measured by. And it's kept me going because I'm, of course, in a denomination where we're kind of sliding in many ways, right? I'm in churches that are not doing well numerically or financially, but that's not the measure of who they are. You can be faithful from beginning to end, and being faithful at the end is just as important as being faithful at the beginning. Amen. Are there any questions that I cannot answer? Yeah.
I led my congregation through, I don't know if this is based on Ballard's work. I don't know if you're familiar with the book.
I think it may be.
It certainly looks like it.
Yep.
Let the folks on here, if you find speaking to the mic.
And introduce yourself first.
Okay. Yeah, I'm Joel Biggers from Northampton, serving two congregations, St. Paul's and St. Peter's. And so I led one of my congregations, actually both of them, through a Ballard bell curve similar to this. And as a relatively new pastor to these congregations, I found where they placed themselves considerably more optimistic than how I experienced them. And so I have another kind of upcoming workshop with them where I'll probably revisit this curve. So how brutally honest should a pastor be with his or her vision and interpretation of the data?
I think you say your truth, but I think one of the things that has to happen obviously, if we're going to go forward, something's got to change. Like we're going to have to change. That means we're going to have to work on redevelopment. We're going to have to do some different things. But this is not sustainable. We all know that, right? So the good news is there are ways that hopefully some of our churches can be redeveloped and redefined and rebirthed. There are creative ways of doing that. But I think the honest conversation needs to add, fine, if you think you're still at the stability and health stage, and I'm looking and I've seen, like, I can look at the Mission Insight thing. I can see where our attendants are, right? But this is not sustainable long term. So let's think about some new things, right? Cannot stay the same. Change is, well, change. It's just inevitable, right? So I think as long as that happens, I think there are ways of doing that. But I mean, again, it's that balance of saying, let's try a new thing. When I was at the large church in Dallas, they tried to do small groups. One time they went out and tried to create small groups across Dallas. The second time they tried to do it, it failed. Both times failed. Finally, the third time something happened. And so they ended up about 25 small groups across the city. But it was so interesting. They kept trying, and then something hit. And I often say that 80% of my ministry is a failure because I tried so many new things and most of the time it didn't work, right? But as with us, trying new things, and with them to say, we just got to try a new thing. Right? And let's just never just say it's going fine. We'll just keep on going like this. If you're going to throw yourself out there and try to change with the times, you've got to ask your congregations to do the same as well. Right? That's no definitive answer, like I said. What else are you going to do except invite them to change, right?
Good morning. I'm Jeff Brinks. This still marinating, so it probably will come out making no sense. But that said, I was struck by your statement that in the church we have one job, or we're taught to do one thing, and that is to teach how to love. So I'm letting that echo in my mind. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, hearing even this discussion about we have to do new things. And it feels wrong. And the way it feels wrong is that if it is indeed our job to learn how to love God and to love each other, is it that we have to learn something new that's not that? or do we have to learn ways to expand that one thing that we're supposed to do?
We have to learn how to love in new ways, right? I mean, that's what we're saying. I mean, you got to learn to love new people that we would not have welcomed 50 years ago, right? I mean, again, the work is love. I got to learn how to love myself, others that I can barely stand, and I got to learn people that I don't really like, and also sometimes people that I know that maybe we shut the door on 50 years ago, we wouldn't have listened to. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that's really thoughtful, and I appreciate the sort of kind of rumbling with that. Learning to love in new ways.
Kimberly Baronato, I'm the pastor at Long Swamp UCC in Myrdstown. I was thinking a lot about this sharing a pastor model and how we're talking about that's, something that used to happen all the time. And I think of this story that our historical society told me of Reverend Bond, who was a really famous pastor in our area who served like 6 churches. And when the switch came from horse and buggy to car, he no longer had time to write his sermon and kept crashing his car because he used to write his sermon while his horse was taking him from church to church. So, and with that comes, so sure, this is a thing we did, but I guess I find it less realistic because there isn't a hair pastor who is being carried from church to church by his horse, who doesn't have a wife, who is doing all of the house maintaining and all of the caring for the children and all of the, I guess I struggle with, and there are plenty of places where this model works, but I guess I struggle for the push for this for all churches when it feels so unrealistic with the modern demands of our world, when you just don't have the same model that used to work with pastor sharing churches.
I think one of the things I often say to churches as well when I do this work is that you do realize you went from full-time to part-time, and it means part-time, even if you're sharing a pastor. That really means that she or he cannot be at the CE meeting like they were, when they were full-time, because they're also having to, pastor another congregation. So that invitation to be realistic, it is not a solution for just substituting full-time. We still get a full-time pastor. Now, the good thing I say to them, which I often had to point out when I was a pastor who served in a part-time way. I was never a part-time pastor, but I served congregations in a part-time capacity, was there are times when I cannot be there for you because I'm working my other job. And if so-and-so job is there and I got it, that's what, in a part-time setting. But if you put 2 churches together, there's a chance I can be at the hospital because there's more flexibility, right? So I'm not saying that's a solution, and I get it. I don't, look, I think I'm probably 15 years from retirement. I think more than likely at the end of my career, I'll be back in the parish again, and I'll probably be serving congregations part-time, either 2 or 3, or working at Target and working again. Done retail before, can do it again. Don't want to do it again, but that just may be the nature of it, and I don't have a solution to the pull that would happen. I have a spouse too, and I've got 2 dogs, not 2 kids, but they seem like kids sometimes, right? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was thinking that,
I was thinking that I often said that my job is to work myself out of a job as a pastor. That part of my job is to encourage the members to develop their own ministries. And I'm wondering if that isn't why the early model worked, because the pastors trained their members in their own ministries so that they didn't have to do much of the kind of work that pastors do now.
Yeah, I agree. The biggest failure of my last church that I didn't get until the last 3 years of that ministry, was I was running myself ragged and I was disempowering the congregation. And so one of the things I did was, it's time for a diaconate. We're going to do a diaconate. We're going to get 4 deacons that we can trust to do the things that I can do. Best thing I ever did. But that
I just said to my colleague on the ride here is that, remember that what Moses had to do.
That's right. That's exactly right. And to your point, I mean, maybe that's the model, that emphasis on the side of sharing, to say, I'm handing some of the ministry back to you.
Right.
And part of that is to say, when I can't get to the hospital, there should be 2 deacons there within 3 hours. Right, if possible, right? To be able to say, I don't need to be the only person. And maybe we become less pastor-centered, and maybe that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that's okay that I'm not the center of church life.
Exactly, yeah. Thank you.
I'll stay here. I'm Wally. I'm a part-time pastor. But to affirm what you're saying, love is the answer to it all. I'll just push back a little bit in saying that there's more people. I did some work down in Allentown and after-school program. But the church I was right next to it that sponsored us had hardly anyone in the church. We had kids all over the place, right? But the relationship was never worked out there. So the church suffered of lack of individuals, but there's more people now in Allentown than there ever has been, and that's why I push back that there's more people in our neighborhoods than there's ever has been. Now, who do we invite? And that's my challenge. I affirm you got, too many of us are trained to paint the walls and not love each other. So we spend a lot of time painting the walls and worshiping the building, but we don't learn the hard work of being patient, kind, gentle, blah, 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 blah. So I just wanted to reaffirm that in those small groups is where I see transformation, where actually, I'm blessed. I have a pulpit now to give them heck, to go out and do the good. But it's still when they are together with others and they see the pain and suffering of each other, where the best ministry and the best transformation occurs. In the pew, many times they just leave here because it's a social club. And that's why many churches die, because it just becomes a social club and not discipling.
Right.
And if we don't teach each other to disciple to each other, the pastor's going to ruin it, or whatever. Yeah. My concern.
No, I think you're right. I do want, again, I always, a little bit of side cringes a little bit about the social club thing, because I just remember that people are really lonely. They're really lonely in our culture. And so there's something to be said for just showing up and being with some people on a Sunday morning, because sometimes it's the only time. But to your point, if that's the point of the church, that ain't enough, right? It's got to be about being a disciple. It's got to be proclaiming the good news of the gospel in word and deed. So I don't think we're far off from each other, but I appreciate those words.
We have 2 more minutes, so that's
1
just
minute
to keep us, oh, look at that, just changed, to keep us on track.
Thank you.
Everybody move to where you can see the screen, if you can't see it now, because our next presenter is Andrew Warner, and as I mentioned to you, he's from Wisconsin. So he's actually going to be on the Zoom screen for us to see, and he's going to be talking with us from his perspective. And so welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Bonnie. It's a delight to be with you today. Thank you for this opportunity to think with you about how our congregations can do more than getting by. I serve the United Church of Christ in 2 roles. I'm the development director for the Wisconsin Conference, and in that role, I do many things, but I also, in that role, work with our congregations that are in the midst of closure or asking questions about closing. Then for the national ministries of the United Church of Christ, I serve as a generosity outreach officer, which means that I'm teaching people about fundraising. In both of those roles, I'm helping people think about the ways in which we're raising, managing, and spending resources to do the work of God in the world. I didn't grow up in the United Church of Christ. As a young adult, I came out as gay. In a small congregation in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I found a warm welcome. And more than that, I found a congregation, a community with a moral vision of what my life would look like. Back in the 1990s, many people couldn't imagine gay marriage, but this congregation lifted it up. In that community, I found a place to grow as a disciple of Jesus. I appreciate the United Church of Christ for providing me not just a welcome, but a meaningful way of life. People across our Christian movement tell stories like that, of how a local congregation made God's love real for them. And yet I hear another story too. Church leaders worry that their congregation will close. I hear over and over again, quote, "I don't want to be the one to turn out the lights on my church." Friends, I'm not worried about turning out the lights. Instead, I think I want to be more than a Motel 6 Christian. I want to do more than keep the lights on. Keeping the lights on, that's the work of getting by. But God calls us to do something more. I believe God transforms lives in beloved community. And I've experienced how local congregations can be partners with God in that amazing work. It's why I'm in the United Church of Christ, and it's why I want to do more than keep the lights on. My faith started in the Roman Catholic tradition, and I find that sometimes I still think about the stories of the saints. During the pandemic, my heart often turned to St. Francis of Assisi. Do you remember how his story began? St. Francis heard Jesus speak to him from the ruins of a country church building. "Build up my church," the voice said. And so Francis began laying tumbled stones back in place, literally rebuilding the ruined church. But throughout his life, Francis accomplished something more, a rebuilding of the church as a community of faith. Shortly after his death, Bouchard of Urbsburg observed, with the world already growing old, of course, this was in like the 1200s, two religious orders arose in the church, whose youth is renewed like an eagle's. In his day, Francis helped rebuild the church, not literally, but more broadly, rebuilding it as a beloved community. I think about Francis in regard to the church today. He reminds me that the church waxes and wanes. He lived in a period of decay and disappointment with the church, and he saw it rebuilt. It would decay and disappoint again and be rebuilt. We live in another moment, facing a challenge of decline and a call to rebuild. Do you hear that voice of Jesus? Build up my church. It still echoes. I hear it as far more than a call to rebuild a physical place, rather a call to recreate and renew community where God's Spirit can transform lives. And yet before talking about what we might rebuild, I think it's important just to review a bit the landscape we face at this moment of the church. We face difficult trends. We've named some of these already, and we know these because we live them. The charts on this slide come from data collected by the National Settings Center on Analytics, Research, Data, and Development, CARD, through the self-reporting of congregations for the yearbook. I encourage you to look at the 11-year report trends of your own congregation in comparison to those of your conference. And I'll share a resource for doing that with Bonnie. And to the person who asked earlier about that difference between how the congregation sees themselves in the life cycle and how the pastor sees it, that 11-year report might provide that outside perspective to kind of ground those observations about life cycle. Over the last 11 years, we saw a continued decline in membership for our congregations. That's the orange line going down. That's a slow and steady trend across the UCC. The other line shows what the relative change looks like in the Penn Northeast Conference. So the conference is not declining in membership as fast as the United Church of Christ as a whole. But I guess the bigger picture is that we're all caught in this downward trend. We're really in this together. What's going on nationally and what's going on in this conference, and I suspect what's going on in your congregations, is one common set of challenges. We're in this together. Congregations give to our church's wider mission basic support because of this. We want to work together to figure out solutions. We rely on each other to help solve challenges that are bigger than any one congregation or pastor. Yet even as we need each other more, congregations face hard choices about their commitments to basic support. When congregations need the conference and national setting more than ever, we face challenges about financially supporting it. The other charts show some noticeable changes in the funding of congregations. Every church is funded with a combination of gifts and other sources like draws on endowments, grants, and fundraisers. Across the religious spectrum, pledges and offerings typically are providing 80% of the funding for a congregation. That was pretty much the picture in the Penn Northeast Conference back in 2012. About 63% of funding came from pledges and offerings. But now, over this 11 years, that's gone down to less than half of our financial support for our church comes from the giving of members in the offering plate. Basically, the current giving of our members and friends is covering a smaller and smaller proportion of our operations, and churches meet this in several ways. Increased spending from their endowments, loans, ever more pressure to hold fundraisers, and the books also get balanced by delaying maintenance and cutting expenses. We'll look more at the way our congregations try to cut expenses in this environment. But for a big picture view, I want to look at changes, the percent of local church funding given to our church's wider mission basic support, to mission projects. This is the category. Could we stop the scrolling of maybe I'm just the only one who finds it distracting, but if you could stop that scroll. So churches share a percentage of their local expenses with the wider church in all their mission projects, both with the conference, with the national setting, and with local mission partners. And that percentage of what we share beyond ourselves has declined. So 12 years ago, it was 6.6% of our budget. Now it's just 4%. We're sharing less resources in our conferences nationally and in Penn Northeast than we did 12 years ago. We're retaining more for our own mission. My colleague, Andy DeBraber, often observes, we can't expect church members to be more generous than their congregation. I think he's right. We can't inspire our members to be more generous, but our congregations themselves are less generous. The tough trends we face might be summarized as less people, less giving, less mission. When people think about these trends, and especially when they feel concerned about the revenue to support their congregation, then I get asked for fundraising tips, and that's the core of my ministry today, is helping people think about how to fundraise. And so I get asked, what can we do better? There is a secret to raising money in churches, one thing that matters most of all. I know of it because of my work with the School of Philanthropy at Indiana University. They've researched this question. The secret to fundraising begins with this one thing. So I want you to write down on a piece of paper, write down your net worth. I'm not going to ask you to share this with anyone else, but there on your paper, just write down your net worth. This is going to help us figure out how to best raise funds for our churches. Just write down your net worth. I'm going to pause here because I just want to make sure that you're not thinking of a number. That's what our culture teaches, that our net worth can be measured in numbers. But God sees our net worth differently. Our value comes as God's beloved children, blessed, known, treasured. We matter. Genesis reminds us that we are made in the image of God. We matter. Paul affirms that our net worth comes because we are children of God, and if children, then heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ. We matter. Following Jesus means understanding the difference between how our culture measures worth and how God does. Faith leads us to discover the hidden truth that we are God's own treasure. And through faith, we shape our lives around that truth. Generosity is just one of the ways we respond to the truth that we matter to God. Fundraising, getting more money into our churches, is not about gimmicks. It's spiritual work. We can best promote giving by framing it as a spiritual practice. That's our way forward, being congregations through which God's Spirit transforms lives in beloved community. And yet when I say that, I often get pushback about the challenge of a church deficit. A leader will ask, how are we going to pay the bills? I heard a story, perhaps apocryphal, of a church treasurer in a congregation that couldn't raise enough money for its budget. They were spending their reserves. And to dramatize the situation, his budget presentation took place against the backdrop of a photo going over Niagara Falls in a barrel. It was all but a blinking red light and a horn announcing danger. Has something similar happened in your congregation? You might hear it in the church president who says at the annual meeting, given our financial trends, we'll be closed in 5 years. Or the stewardship chair who announces, we face a $30,000 deficit. We need everyone to give to keep the lights on. Those voices focus on financial problems, speaking from a place of urgency. Urgency, from the Latin to pressure, involves a moment or problem that insists or compels action. Urgency can be motivating because it names an immediate and large problem, but it can also leave people overwhelmed and uncertain about their ability to make a difference. For this reason, we often do better to use the language of agency. Agency, rooted in older words that mean to act, names our capacity to make a difference. Framing questions in terms of agency names the way the choices we make can change the outcome of a situation. Facing a budget deficit, a consistory president might say, we face some choices because of the gap between our financial resources and our vision of ministry. We could increase our individual giving. We could adjust our vision of what God calls us to do as a church. We could think about new ways to do ministry together. We could look at what we can each do personally to help grow the church. Using the language of agency shifts the conversation from a balance sheet to people's own behaviors and actions. Urgency uses fear. This awful thing will happen to motivate people. Fear provides the pressure. The language of agency reminds people of their inherent ability and power to choose their future. Instead of fear, agency speaks of capacity. It helps us imagine what we could do together. Urgency views people as pocketbooks. Agency views people as God does. Inherent treasure, able to make a difference. The imminence of some situations demands urgency, but demands agency. Sometimes we must act quickly, but most challenges in the church require cultural shifts. Empowerment, not fear, sustains change over time. If we truly want to do more than getting by, then we will need a mindset of agency, empowered by our ability to make choices about our future, shaped not by fear, but instead by an appreciation of our capacity. Now, I want to think with you about the ways the mindset of urgency and the mindset of agency play out in the lives of congregations. First, I want to talk about what fear does to a congregation, and then second, how we can engage our ability to make a difference. This is a confession moment. I love Jennifer Coolidge and the various roles she's played over the years, and perhaps none more than her portrayal of Tanya McLeod Hunt on the show White Lotus. There's a lot that one could say about this show and its commentary on wealth and luxury, but I'll just mention one oddity. Watching the second season, I wondered how people could travel to Sicily and only ever eat their meals in the lackluster hotel restaurant. It spoke of the insularity of their lives. It seems to me that in this and other ways, the White Lotus makes a nod to the lotus eaters in the ancient story of the Odyssey. In that tale, Odysseus and his sailors get waylaid by the lotus eaters. They forgot the outside world on their journey home. Instead, they lounged in one place. I might call this the White Lotus stumble. I see churches becoming more insular, and here's how it plays out. A church experiences a tight financial moment. A leader uses the language of urgency, and so the church cuts expenses for mission. But the people who connected with the church because of its work in the community stop coming. So the church leader speaks with a new sense of urgency, more cuts, this time to programs. And the people who go because of the programs of the church don't stick around. Now the church leader really feels fear. We must tighten the belts. And so the church cuts staff. A full-time pastor goes to part-time. The part-time pastor goes to quarter-time. And that means that when a person stops in to visit church on a Sunday, there isn't that much mission or program going on. And there isn't a pastor to make a follow-up call. What's left after all these cuts is the building. I've seen this spiral, the White Lotus stumble, play out in many congregations. We cut and we cut and we cut our budgets in order to keep having worship in our building. Preserving the building takes over as the reason for being of the church. But God doesn't call us to preserve buildings. No, God calls us to transform lives in beloved community. Amy Larimore crystallized this for me. She's led many nonprofit organizations and thinks deeply about what it means to be generous. Reflecting on the church, she once said, "We can't sacrifice the faith of the next generation on the altar of our preferences." I heard it like a thunderclap. I know a local congregation that was trying to decide between worship at 8 a.m. in the morning or moving to a later service at 10 a.m. The farmers who had long belonged to the church liked the 8 a.m. service. But in recent years, people moved in and bought vacation homes in the area. Some were interested in the church, but didn't want to wake up for an early service on vacation. But the church voted 8 a.m., the altar of our preferences. Getting by means finding ways to meet our own preferences, but we can do more. What would it mean to privilege the needs, desires, hopes of people who don't attend our congregations? To center the faith of the next generation. I saw this communion table that's going to come up next. I saw this communion table at a church in North Carolina. Most tables have a line from scripture, "Do this in remembrance to me." But this church faced a question every time they came to the table. Has everyone been fed? It's just as scriptural. As Paul said to the Corinthians, when you come together, it's not really to eat the Lord's Supper, for when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes away hungry, and another becomes drunk. This question on the communion table turns the congregation outward to think of their neighbors near and far. Has everyone been fed? Doing more than getting by begins when we center the future and privilege people other than ourselves. We can't long be in our communities without realizing uncomfortably at times how people see us. This happened to me at a Starbucks. I went in to order a grande and a pup cup, a coffee and a cup of whipped cream. The barista looked at me. I'm a bigger guy. I know we're not in person, but you can't see that I'm a bigger guy. I know it. And so seeing me, the barista said, "Do you want a spoon with that pup cup?" I blurted out, "Why would my dog need a spoon?" And in the awkward silence, we both realized that she thought I was going to hop in my truck and just smash that pup cup into my own mouth. Can't control how people see us. People will look at our congregations and make judgments. They will hear, well, Christian, and they'll think of their other experience of Christians. And so we need to find ways to tell our story, to make clear that we see people, we see the net worth of people, that we know that no matter what, people are the beloved of God. To do this, we need more clarity about our mission. Many congregations have wordy mission statements. I think in many of our congregations, maybe half of our congregations, there are more words in the mission statement than there are people in the pews on Sunday. But even when that's not true, even when it's a tight mission statement, there often it comes down to saying that at this church, we'll be all things to all people anywhere. That's the subtext of most of our mission statements. Mission clarity means the ability to say in everyday language why your church matters. First Congregational in Janesville, Wisconsin, started renovating the oldest part of their building. When they pulled down the plaster, they found 2 boarded up windows. One said, "God is love." The other, "Feed my lambs." These forgotten windows felt like a message from their spiritual ancestors. It resonated. They thought about all that they did as an open, affirming, and immigrant welcoming congregation active in their community. It also spoke to the wider vision of the United Church of Christ, united in Christ's love, a just world for all. As the church thought about these discovered windows and what they did, they came to clarity about why they existed. They were the #Love and Justice Church. With those 5 words, people in the community knew exactly who they were and what they were about: love and justice. Like it or not, people know this congregation is different than other ones, and they're responding by engaging the church. Doing more than getting by will require us to name with clarity why we exist. Personally, I'm with the #Love and Justice Church. But I also love the congregation who says, "Come to Peace UCC, where no one fits and everyone belongs." And St. Paul's, which is just kind, just love, just church. Earlier, I noted the stumble that many congregations make, focusing more and more resources on a building instead of other aspects of the congregation. But some congregations make a radical choice to sell their building. Some of those congregations experience renewed vitality. The memories fill our buildings. I remember a church leader who described as if it was yesterday his wedding. Even after 60 years, the pews of the church were filled with the memory of his family and friends. Those memories are precious. But at the same time, memories can slide into nostalgia, a false and romantic memory of what used to be but never was. Nostalgia affects many of our churches. You might hear it in the used to be's. Used to be that kids' sports didn't happen on Sunday. Used to be people came every week. Does your congregation have used to be attitudes? I went to one congregation and I was struck by not just the level of nostalgia, but the way in which it was really about recriminations. This was a small church that is on the cusp of deciding to close. And as we talked, what became clear is that what people held on most tightly to were their angers and disappointments with people who had come before them. Their anger at a pastor who served them 10 years ago. Their frustration with a volunteer who stopped doing her volunteer role in the church and had the audacity to keep a laptop from the church office. When I met with them, we spent actually 20 minutes of this group talking about this laptop. And I asked finally in frustration, how old is this laptop? It was an 8-year-old laptop and they couldn't even run any of the programs, like the PowerPoint couldn't even run on this laptop, it was so old. It was worth nothing. And yet so much energy was put into those recriminations. Nostalgia can sometimes be a rosy colored memory. Sometimes it can be a deeply held resentment. But I find again and again, it gets in the way of a congregation moving forward. But at First Congregation in East Troy, First Congregation in East Troy started as one of those places. Much of every dollar that was given to the church went into maintaining a building. Everything else got cut. Still, the building slowly decayed around them. All people talked about was finding a way to pay for the next repair. And then, in a bold move, the congregation sold the building and used the funds to create an endowment. The congregation rented space from a community center. And then new people started joining. Once dispirited by decay, the congregation started having other stories to tell. Attendance is now double what it was before the pandemic. It wasn't big before the pandemic, but they've doubled their attendance since the pandemic. Here's a picture of their new members who are joining. I'm not saying that every church must sell their building, but I do find that churches must shed nostalgia and especially recriminations if we're going to do more than getting by. Honestly, a mindset of agency shows up in our willingness to experiment and adapt, to figure out what we can do to make a difference. Salem UCC is a small church at a rural crossroads in Wisconsin. I know you have these kind of churches in Pennsylvania too. This is a church that's on the outskirts of a town that's on the outskirts of a town that's on the outskirts of Milwaukee. I mean, they're on the corner of nowhere in rural Wisconsin. The small congregation, on the picture on the bottom, you see everyone who's connected to the church is gathered on the steps. They had this education building that they weren't using, and but they had just a few youth who said, "Hey, could we do a project to gather clothes for people who might be in need?" And this project, this idea grew in the minds of their church council. And so they said, well, actually, we could just turn our education building into a clothes closet. And so they began to work on this project. And they made it their one mission project. They don't have any other mission projects going on as a church, but they said, we can do this one thing. And now, if you're in their area of the county, this is the place to go to find youth clothing, nice used clothing. They've actually brought in people who didn't go to their church are now volunteering with their clothes pantry. They've brought people who had kind of wandered from the church back into their community. And the people who are there have a reinvigorated sense of their purpose because they're making a difference for their neighbors. As an experiment, a willingness to take a risk led to a revitalized sense of purpose. I said earlier that I believe God's Spirit transforms lives through community. I hope these examples from Wisconsin might spark ideas here. I want to underscore the need that exists across our country, and Kevin alluded to this as well. Surgeon General Dr. Vivek Murthy calls loneliness an epidemic. He recently pointed out that at any one moment, 1 in 2 Americans feel lonely. This presents a health problem. As he observed, loneliness is more than just a bad feeling. When people are socially disconnected, their risk of anxiety and depression increases. So does their risk of heart disease, dementia, and stroke. The increased risk of premature death associated with social dislocation is comparable to smoking daily and may be even greater than the risk associated with obesity. The Surgeon General approaches it as a public health question. How can we repair our social fabric? Well, in church, we have a cure for loneliness, community. I began to think about this in terms of my local congregation. I live in a town in Wisconsin, a rural town of 10,000. We have a small church in the town, 50 people, 60 people on a Sunday. But what the research is suggesting is that, of the adults in our community, 1/3 are really experiencing that moment. 1/3, maybe a half, are experiencing loneliness in that moment. So if we just look at the adults near my local church, that's maybe, we'll say it's 6,000 people. So 2,000 of them we'll estimate down are lonely that day. We don't advance yet. So we have 2,000 people in our small town who might be lonely. Well, even a fraction of those people coming to my local church will be transformative. If we could connect with 60 of those lonely people, we would have twice as many people in worship. What I'm saying is that in all of our rural communities, even with people having moved out, even with people having left, there are plenty of people who need the kind of beloved community we offer in our churches. This is what we miss in a focus on deficits and decline. Our neighbors want the very thing that we're best at, community. But again, what message do people hear about our congregation? Does the fear of decline and our focus on the building mean that we're asking people to join to pay the light bill, to repair the roof? That's what people hear when the mindset of urgency shapes our congregations, when we get locked into nostalgia for the used to be time. Or are we reaching out to see if people want to discover with us God's spirit in community? The mindset of agency causes us to approach people differently, open to what we can do together. When I talk about this in Wisconsin, I get pushback, usually along the lines of, but our church is so small, and all the families are going to that new evangelical church. Well, earlier this week, I visited some of our congregations down south, where they have a name for that congregation that has all the families. Six Flags Over Jesus. Now, you might know this church. It has so many people that there's a pickleball league for 3-year-olds. Small churches may not be able to compete with that. In Wisconsin, few of our churches can say, we have all the kids. But what we have learned is that we can authentically say, we will love all of your kids. And I think that's profound. This is a picture of a small church. This is nearly everyone in the Trinity UCC church in Portage, Wisconsin. I was visiting with them on the day that their church council, which is all gathered here, has decided to sell their building and move into a rented place. The church leaders had decided that they wanted to stay together as a church until their oldest member, who was 94, passed away. And then they're planning to go and join another congregation that they share a lay leader with. So they made this plan. This is a small church. They have like one 94-year-old member, and then you see one child, a grandson, who comes to the church. This is a small place. And so they moved into rented space. And wouldn't you know it, they moved into this rented space, and they've got a new person joining them. So that 94-year-old might die, and they're going to continue to be a church, because what they're finding is there are people that are hungry for community, and there are people that want to go to a place where all of who they are will be loved. This is true across the UCC. We may not have pickleball, but whatever pickle you get yourself into, we'll love you. So friends, we can do more than getting by. We don't have to worry about money. We don't have to have fears about it, because money always follows mission. Let's say that again. One of the things that I've learned in fundraising, and that I know is true in my own giving and is true across the country, is that money follows mission. So I want to close with Acts 6, which is the story of Peter appointing the first deacons. It came at a moment of conflict in the early church in Jerusalem. The Greek-speaking members felt their widows and orphans were getting left out in the distribution of food, so they complained. Peter appointed the first 7 deacons to take care of distributing food in the community. In a good move, all of the deacons had Greek names. But with Peter, the good and the bad was woven together. He also dismissed that work of the deacons. If you look at the text, he says the deacons would just do that lowly work of giving out the food, while Peter and the apostles devoted themselves to the holy work. Peter turned inward to just be churchy, and he left the work of mission, of service to the lowly deacons. After Peter said he'd just be churchy, his role in the story largely ended. All the action moves forward with the deacons. Philip, Stephen, as they found ever new people to serve. And then Paul, Barnabas, Timothy, and more, as they each carried the gospel forward in service. Peter remained in Jerusalem, just getting by. The Holy Spirit went with those who served. Friends, I don't know what the future holds, but I know the Spirit of God transforms lives in beloved community. And if we focus on that mission, we'll do far more than getting by. Thank you for listening to my thoughts. I'd love to engage you with conversation and questions that might arise in your minds as we think together about what it means for the church to do more than getting by.
Andrew, this is Steve Hummel. I have a question. In the chat, we were discussing earlier in some of the questions, you had mentioned that some of the work that we're doing with relationship building at our church is extremely important. Could you say more about that and relationship building tools or methodology that we might be able to implement? Sorry.
I mean, years ago, I attended a workshop on evangelism, kind of one of these ones that was done as part of the God is Still Speaking campaign. I remember the presenter said, ministry is a contact sport. And I really think that that's true, that it is really a contact sport. We're meant to be in relationship with people, to be engaged with them, to know them, to love them, and not just the minister, but the people together. And, over the pandemic, I've done a number of friends who are leaving churches that they had belonged to. And a common theme was they found that they were not as deeply woven into the fabric of that community as they thought. And it showed up for them, the fact that no one reached out. And it wasn't just whether the pastor reached out, it was that the church members didn't reach out. So, friends lost a parent, and while the pastor called and checked in on him, the fact that no one in the church picked up the phone and made a phone call made him realize, I'm not in relationship with these people. In comparison, I know a church here in Green Bay, Wisconsin, that really leaned into calling on each other during the pandemic. And they really put all of their energies not into making sure they had a hybrid service that was just like the in-person worship service. They made sure that people were getting calls throughout the pandemic. And when they came back together, there were more of them after the pandemic because they had really invested not just in the pastor making a call, but on church members calling each other. I mean, I think that investment in relationships mattered for that church, and I see it mattering for other for congregations. We are a community organization, and the more that we lean into that and realize that that's our superpower. I really think relationships are the superpower of Christianity, and that's what we can uniquely do well. So it's worth investing our resources in it. Because I focus on fundraising, it's not I can't say that I have a great curriculum that I know of for doing this relational work, but I just know that that's the secret recipe of what we need to be doing is that investing in relationships, nurturing it. I'll say one activity that a board of deacons might do is to take a picture directory of all of your church members and just to think about when was the last time I had a meaningful conversation with this person, and identify who in your picture directory has no one on the board of deacons had a meaningful conversation with in the last 2 months, and then try to reach out to those people. And you can do that activity regularly, every quarter in the life of your congregation, and just see who are the people that we're missing. Because what happens sometimes in church is that the person that's best known it's, a ride to every chemotherapy appointment. But someone else gets overlooked. And that's not who we want to be. And so we need an intentional practice on our board of deacons, someone other than the pastor, thinking about who are we maybe missing in our care.
Thank you very much.
Can I go now? Thank you for your presentation. My name is Kathy Braley. And the question I would like to ask you is that in watching the TikTok videos, I see that there seem to be significant numbers of people who are involving themselves in deconstructing, they call it deconstructing Christianity. And these are people who have been in, I'll say, conservative Christian churches, who feel that it's a toxic environment for them, for various reasons, period, full stop. And what I would like to know is, I wonder if the United Church of Christ has considered this as a mission field of people to whom to reach, and if those people are evenly distributed or if they are more to be found, I would say, in the southern states, perhaps in the Midwest. So I'd like you to address that question. Thank you.
Yeah. So when I've looked at this kind of question, and there's a study called, I think it's the Faith Communities Today, or it's the FACT study, and you can find more about it on the CARD site. And maybe, Bonnie, I'll get you an email address or a website address that you can circulate it around. There's definitely research on this question. I think that the process of people de-churching is across our country. It happens for different reasons and in different ways, but it is across the country. And so what it might look like in Pennsylvania up through New England is really people opting out of Roman Catholicism. And there was definitely a spike of people becoming de-churched through the clergy sexual abuse scandal. In Wisconsin and the upper Midwest, it might look like, you're saying about conservatives. I mean, we have a lot of conservative Lutherans and people saying that they're done with church. People are opting out for lots of reasons, sometimes because they've been really hurt by intolerance or judgment in their, whatever their local faith community was. But there are also people who are asking questions about meaning and purpose and direction in their lives, and that are hungry for that and want to find a space to ask those kind of questions. Your conference minister, Bonnie, has done research with young adults who are asking some of those questions, and has just recently published a book on that very topic. So she might actually be, Bonnie, you might be able to tell us better even about that. But, I think we sometimes think how many people are de-churching, but what we don't realize is that there's lots of, in my church town of 10,000, there's more than enough people asking questions about meaning in their life to fill my church.
Yeah. Well, I will talk about Hear Us Out for a moment. The 7 other authors and I interviewed 220 18 to 35-year-olds in the Lehigh Valley. You can read the book, but what I will tell you that we found that were most important to those age groups were community. In other words, they needed a place where they could belong, and contrary to popular belief, that's not social media. They wanted a place where they could have meaningful relationships of community that fed them and connected them to defeat that loneliness that you were talking about before. The second thing they wanted was to make a difference in the life of at least one person. It didn't have to be a big thing. It didn't have to be an international thing. They wanted to just make a difference. And for us, that's mission and how we do mission. And the third thing they wanted, which I think the United Church Church of Christ is poised to help with is they wanted a safe place to ask questions. They wanted to be able to ask, why do bad things happen and God lets it work that way? Why did the church used to do this and that? Why is it we don't care about this subject? What's the reason we have 85 translations of Scripture and they're all different? They want a safe place to come and ask the questions that we sometimes don't want to grapple with. But I think if our churches did those three things, created true community, gave people an opportunity to do mission and make a difference, and to be a safe place to ask questions, church decline might reverse.
Yep. And what I want to underscore on what Bonnie has said is that this is not rocket science. You know, we know how to do these things. I think even if we think back, you know, for those of you who are grandparents, if you think about, you know, how you might love your grandchildren, or for any of us who've had close relationships with grandparents, you know, like everyone, I had 4 grandparents, and, you know, my grandfather was the best at loving us grandkids because of the way in which he paid attention, not to what he wanted us to do, but paid attention to what we wanted to do. And he followed our lead. I don't know that we do that often when new people come into our churches. We follow that. Instead we want to acculturate them into what we've long done, that nostalgia. But if we follow their lead, which is what Bonnie, you did in that interview process, it was brilliant.
Well, and I think what we discovered is there's much more craving for spirituality than we may have thought in those age groups. They just don't trust the institution of church, because often they have either been hurt by the church themselves, or someone they know has been hurt by the church, or we make church life all about worship, and obviously it should be, and we eliminate the opportunity to do mission, which church also should be. I know that I could have asked he was then 30-year-old son to come and do something at the church I was serving. I said, we're having a community dinner. He would say, okay, so how many people do you want to feed, and how many people do you need to serve, and we'll do the menu, and we'll bring all this stuff. So he and 8 of his friends would come and do this community meal for the church. Or I would call him and say, we're doing a Habitat for Humanity thing on Saturday. And he'd go, oh, good, I have 4 friends with pickup trucks and tools. Where should we meet you? They want to do something meaningful, but he was never going to come and sit and worship. I think I got him to 1 Christmas service and my installation. I think those were the 2 times he sat in church. But he would have come and done anything in the community for us. And I think that's one of the things that we found most in the research. There must be another question. Otherwise, I can keep talking, but, you know, y'all know me well enough to know that. Rich.
As I looked at the various churches you were inviting us into, there seemed to be a lack of diversity in all kinds of respects, and I have felt a failure at promoting that or allowing that to happen in the congregations I've served, and I'd like you to talk about that. Thank you.
Sure. I appreciate you bringing that up. I would say, you know, overall in the Wisconsin Conference that we are an overwhelmingly white Christian movement, and we have work to do around anti-racism, and that is work that many of our congregations are working on. You know, I think that the congregations that I, you know, profiled I leaned into stories of a number of our smallest and rural congregations, because I thought that is often where we're experiencing questions about sustainability and future. But all of our congregations need to be, we're going to want to look at questions of racial diversity and many kinds of diversity in our congregations. And this is a struggle for our churches. I think to bring it down to another local congregation. So the town that I live in is in a county that has 3 Native American reservations in it. About 10% of our county are people who are tribal members, who are indigenous, and many others who have indigenous ancestry. So that's what racial diversity looks like in the county that I live in. 10% of the population is indigenous, about 90% of the population is white. And our congregation reflects that, some of those numbers. But, it shows the tensions also show up, say, in music, that there's a tension in my local congregation between some of our oldest members who most want to hear the organ played, and slowly and with the oldest hymns. I just be honest, this is this is what they want. And then we have once a month, we have a praise band that is composed of some tribal members who are in their 20s who play contemporary praise music. I know our pastor is both wanting to make more space for the gifts of these young men, and sees that as important for our future and an important ministry today. And it's part of the story of trying to move in our context to be a congregation that can talk about the longstanding tensions between white people and indigenous people in our small town. And there's a lot to unpack for the congregation, but it also shows up in an intergenerational, interracial difference of direction. So that's not an answer, but just to say our congregations are struggling in some of the same ways as you might be in the Penn Northeast Conference to address issues of racism and to connect in new ways and to grow in ways that start to be truly welcoming to people who are not cisgendered white heterosexuals.
There are no more questions, it appears, Andrew.
Sure. I just want to draw a line under one thought that I was trying to lift up in the presentation, and that is the way in which our love of a church building can get in the way of the future of our congregation. And I really feel like that's a crux of a place to look. Simon Sinek, who you may be familiar with from his writing and talking about discovering your why and understanding your purpose. He was, I heard him speaking once, and he talked about how every CEO that he knows talks about how one of their top priorities is valuing their employees. But what Simon Sinek observed is that those same CEOs also want to return market value to the stock market, please their shareholders, earn a profit, expand their market share. So they have several other priorities, all of which that come ahead of taking care of their employees. And so his observation was that what those CEOs are doing is always sacrificing the care of their employees for these other priorities. And I think that's what is happening in our congregations, that while people say that we value mission, that we value programs, that we value our staff, and we value our building, the reality is that we place the building as the most important priority, and we're paying the price for it. And I just think that our way forward with sustainability is to reimagine what we make our top priority, and that's going to be key to our congregations moving forward, to changing where they are in the bell curve. So I just want to highlight that from it.
Thank you, Andrew. glad that you said that, because one of the things I often say to churches is that you can be a church without a building, but it's hard to be a church without a pastor. Y'all have heard this at least once, right? Okay, we're going to break for lunch. We're actually like 5 minutes early, don't faint. Lunch is in the fellowship hall downstairs. If you have trouble with stairs, there are fewer stairs if you go around the building and in the door from the side parking lot. If you don't have trouble with stairs, as you leave the sanctuary, turn to the left and then go through the double doors on the right, and the stairs will be there, and there is a sign that says Fellowship Hall. I want to thank you for your attention this morning. We're going to talk a lot more about demographics when you come back from lunch. I know everybody's favorite subject. But you do have a Mission Insight report, and we want to be able to use that as a tool for our conversation. I'm going to take a moment and bless the food before we go downstairs, so would you be in prayer with me? Holy and eternal God, we have gathered here to learn about how to serve your church, about how to renew and refresh and transform. Help us be open to all the conversations we will have, and all the conversations we will have over food at table. We ask you to bless that food so that we might be the people you have called us to be, energized by its nourishment, as you energize our spirits. In the beloved name of Christ we pray. Amen. All right, good. So thank you very much for being on time. I am one of these people who starts on time. So when you came in today, one of the things you had in your packet is a Mission Insight report. How many of you have ever seen a Mission Insight report before? Oh, yay, I'm so glad. How many of you find it exciting reading? Oh, not many, I don't think. Here's the thing about a Mission Insight report. What you have right now is the executive summary, which, if it's printed on one side, is 16 pages long. So this is a document that obviously we don't make 85 copies per church for. However, I want us to look at it for a moment as a tool for doing the things that Andrew was talking about and that Kevin was talking about. How to assess where you are. How many of you have seen a local church profile? How many have you done a reassessment of a local church profile with your church where you are right now? Okay, so 2 things. As we move into the Mission Insight report, it answers or partially answers the question, who is my neighbor? That is in the local congregational profile. Now think for a moment about who you are right now as a church. That's one of the things that both Kevin and Andrew talked about. Where are you? Who are you? One of the tools that you can use to determine that is the local church profile. There are 3 questions in the local church profile that you could utilize with your church when they're not in a search. Hint, hint, you heard that right? Not in a search. One of those is the question, who are we now? And you likely have access to all this information. How many people come to worship? How many people used to come to worship 5 years ago? How many people are in your membership list, your active membership list? How many people come to Sunday school? How many baptisms have you done? How many funerals? How many weddings? All of that kind of basic statistical information, in addition to your 11-year report, you can have access to right now. The local church profile is available from the national setting, and if you don't want to search their website, which, excuse me, is challenging at best, send me an email and I will be happy to send you a copy of the blank local church profile. Look at that question, who are we now, as a way of determining the characteristics of your congregation, as the baseline point for where you are. Hint, hint. If you haven't sent an annual report into the office to go to the national setting, your 11-year report is likely to have 6 years of the same numbers. So if you get your report and it has all the same numbers for 11 years, unless it's a miracle, that's not true. So if you fill out your annual year-end reports and send them to the conference office and we can send them to the national setting, that report gets updated. So you can have an 11-year report very easily sent to you, as well as a local church profile. The second question in the local church profile that I want you to consider looking at as a congregation is, who is our neighbor? And part of the way you can answer that question, I suppose, is to go outside the door at the church and look at the neighborhood, right? That might be a useful tool every so often. But the other way that you can get some of that information is to look at a local church profile. To look at a Mission Insight report. The Mission Insight reports that I printed for you are all done with a 5-mile radius. Depending on your church, 2.5 miles, a half mile, 15 miles might be more appropriate. But you can go to our conference website and have access to the Mission Insight that you can run your own reports for. If you're reluctant to try one more service online, send an email to us at the conference office and we will send you a Mission Insight report with a different mileage. Yes, ma'am?
This is somebody from Zoom and they cannot hear anything on Zoom. Really?
Oh, we'll fix it. Thank you. Because my phone's turned off, so. I'm not going to repeat all of that. The question is, can you hear me now? This is not a Verizon question.
They're not shaking their head.
Try that one more time.
Can you hear me now? Oh, good. All right, so I was beginning to talk about the Mission Insight reports that I believe we emailed to you if you were on Zoom, and that you have in hard copy in your packets. By the way, I would be happy to email them to you as well. You just have to let me know. As I was saying, they all have a 5-mile radius. If you're an urban church, that might be too big a distance. If you're a rural church, that might not be enough distance. So the circle of the map on the front is a 5-mile radius from your church building. Now, if you look at the second page of Mission Insight, and trust me, I'm not going to read every one of these pages to you, you will begin to see population changes and household trends. The one I'm looking at had a 14% change between years 2010 and 2028 projected. Just so you know, this data comes from the census reports that are done every 10 years, but it also comes from school districts, which do their reporting annually. And twice a year, there is a survey about religious trends that goes out to a variety of locations to fill in that piece. So this will tell you population changes, household changes, family changes. And then you have lots of pictures and graphs as you go back in the report. racial ethnic population. You will be amazed how many times I go to visit a small church who says, oh, there are no people of color in our neighborhood. And then I print the Mission Insight report for them, and they have 12% people of color in their town. So this is a fairly good representation of a year ago's census data about racial ethnic groups. The one I'm looking at, for instance, has, I can't even read. 91% Caucasian, 1% Asian, 1% Pacific Islander, 5% Hispanic and Latino, and 1% people of African descent. But that adds up to several percentages of people of color in their communities. So just because you don't know that they're there doesn't mean that they're not there. And this is important information for your church to have. If you look at age trends, I think that Andrew alluded to the fact, and so did Keith, about serving the people that are there. How many of you have had your church say, we need more young families with children? How many of you have a school system that's shrinking? There are not enough young families with children. If they come to your church, it's likely they came from another church. They haven't necessarily moved into town. But I remember working with a congregation who was really anxiety prone about not having young children and families. And they looked at their Mission Insight report and determined that the largest growing population in their community was between 45 and 60. So what I said to them is, so what are you doing for the people who are between 45 and 60? Are you doing an empty nesters workshop for the folks whose last kids are going off to college? Are you do something on pre-retirement planning? How are you serving the population that's growing near your church? And that's another reason for utilizing this report. It will tell you how many kids are in elementary school. It will tell you how many kids are in high school. It will help you look at the trends of the number of folks in the community by age, by home ownership, by income. All of these things can help your church plan its next program to support the people in your community. Family income is trended, household and children are trended, marital status is trended, and by the way, the number of divorced, separated, and widowed people are growing in most communities. So how are you serving widows in your community? What are you doing for divorced folks or separated folks? Educational levels are here, so if you're writing your sermons at a graduate PhD level and people are falling asleep, maybe you need to look at what the educational makeup of both your congregation and your community is, so you're giving people messages about God and the gospel that are messages that they can understand. Levels of employment and types of employment are listed in this directory. And then there's this funky thing called mosaics. Now, you need to know that I have an entire notebook in my office that talks about mosaic groups. Some of these might seem really familiar to you, though. Thriving boomers. How many here's a baby boomer? Okay, so you know what a boomer is. Settled in suburbia has a particular set of behavioral characteristics. Singles have a particular kind of behavioral information and perspectives. So if you are interested in learning more about mosaic groups, you can actually utilize the information at the bottom of page 13 and look at how they define a Mosaic group. It might help you determine how you can best serve the people that are in your community. Because if you're offering a program for boomers that doesn't focus on their thriving, on their employment, on their leisure, you're likely not going to attract them to your church. So the Mosaic groups can be very helpful in that regard. So can the generational information on page 14. Generational information begins talking about the homeland people, the millennial people, the Gen X, the boomers, the silent generation, and begins to share with you some growth and decline of each of those population groups. And there's a religious program or ministry preferences page. Imagine such a thing. You might get to learn about what people think about church and God and worship and scripture. And then you can access whatever kind of supporting information you like. Now, here's what I would like us to do. I don't want to stand here and talk for another hour. So what I would like you to do is find 3 or 4 people, sit next to them in a pew, pick a page of the Mission Insight Report, and talk about that page with your colleagues. Then pick another page and talk about that page with your colleagues. Now, the people on Zoom all have a Mission Insight Report. Please feel free to be a group and talk to each other. We can find a way for them not to be heard in this room, right, Anthony? Yes. And they can just talk to each other. Okay, good. So here's what I would like you to do. I would like you to take the next 15 minutes in groups of 3 or 4, pick a page in the Mission Insight Report, and share and talk with your colleagues. You might share something that you already knew or something that's new to you. Are the instructions clear? About halfway through the 15 minutes, I will ask you to switch to another page, and I hope that you will be able to do that and gain some insight. So just move around. You don't have to all be clustered. There are some people who are all by themselves. Okay, 15 minutes. Okay, could you finish up your conversations and come back to the whole group, please? Anybody see something that was completely surprising to them in this report? See? Maybe you know your communities better than you think. 2 things that I will share with you. On page 15, which is the religious program or ministry preferences, there is an entire report from Mission Insight called A Religiosity Study that has much more detailed information about what people think about God and church and faith. If you would like one of those, please email me, and I will be happy to send it to you. Okay? Yes, Joel.
How do they get that?
They do a semi-annual survey of communities and ask them questions about their faith beliefs, their church experience, and their spirituality desires.
Ooh,
Mission Insight does.
Doesn't the Pew Center do one?
The Pew Center does one as well. So does the Barna Research Group, which tends to be more evangelical, but their data is usually accurate. Kim?
Can I answer your first question?
Yes, please.
So we're back here talking, and we are churches in what consider themselves like farming communities, rural communities, agricultural communities, and we both have
less than 0.5% of people actually in the farming industry. And Michelle and I, 25% of our churches were in professional specialty fields. And so it's just so interesting because if you ask our churches, they would say they were like out in the rural farming community, but the biggest number of people in there are people who are in specialty professional settings.
And I suggest that we have a little consideration for our Zoom people.
Yeah, we're coming with a mic. Kim, you don't have to repeat all that, but I will. The group in the back view themselves as primarily in farming communities. They're in rural locations, and they have an assumption that those are still agriculturally based communities. And yet, what the studies show is that only 0.5% of the population in those communities in that 5-mile radius are farmers, are agricultural workers. There's much higher representation of professional workers. So if you thought you were going to meet the farmers all at the county diner, like I used to do in my first church, 10:30 in the morning, I would meet them for coffee because they were done with milking, right? I would walk from the church to the diner where they were all gathering. If you make that assumption about your community without having some data, you might be surprised. Yeah, we're going to bring the mic to you, Virginia, just a second.
One of the things that struck me when we talked about average household income trend was with Whitehall starting at 58.8 and going to 87.2, which I thought seemed rather low for the Whitehall area, till I realized that when I look at this, it's very similar to this report that you sent out several years ago, which, because we're not Allentown and the urban end of it, and we're not suburban, so to speak, but we're also not rural. We're stuck in the middle between the two. So 87 to me says that's a retirement income, which is exactly what is near us, which is retirement homes and, you have the school districts and stuff, but we don't have a lot of developments near us.
Right.
So we might have to ask if for the 10 miles out for this one. But it was surprising that the income was low, but it was also surprising to me that it really didn't change much from the one you gave us 3 or 4 years ago.
Very interesting. That might make a difference, Kim and Michelle, for you as well in your rural communities if you went out a further distance from the church, because right around the church might be a little less agricultural than further away. Other surprises, questions, weird things that you had no idea existed. Okay, I've had several questions about the Mosaic group page. Okay. When you print the Mosaic group document, it fits in a 1.5-inch binder, which is why I didn't print them for y'all. But you can go on the website that is indicated at the bottom of the page, on that page, and you can print out only the Mosaic groups that are near you or that are identified in your community that may help you. And they list things like political leanings, view on church, view on community activism, view on education, and they do a generalized characteristic, again, from the same kind of surveys that Barna and Pew do. So if you want that, please go to that little link, or make an appointment and come in my office and look at my binder. Anything else surprising? By the way, you can do the same thing with the religious attitudes one, which I think is page 15. Did I mention already that there's a religiosity study? And if you're interested in that, let me know. It's pretty easy to run and send you. Yeah, James. And James got the wrong Mission Insight report, so I will email him the correct one.
Is there a data for estimated disposable income for people in the area?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure. Some of that might be in Mosaic group descriptions, but I'm not sure. I will ask them. They might have it. I just might not know how to find it. I'm happy to talk to the Mission Insight people. We do, after all. And in case you didn't know, in our conference, we pay $11 per church to have access to Mission Insight for you. In fact, the whole Mid-Atlantic region pays that per church. We have a contract with them to do that. So another use of your OCWM dollars at work for you. But by all means, ask for all of the data that you would like from this document. Were there any questions on Zoom? They're all there even. I'm sort of amazed. Oh, James has another question.
So is there you pay $11, how many times can you access?
As many times as you want
Okay, so
during the time of that contract.
I could request every year a copy?
Sure.
To be emailed to us?
Sure. And you could request every year that you could have a copy of each of the reports that they do. There's a full insight, which is a little bigger than this. There's a religiosity one. There are a couple of other categories of them. By all means, ask.
Oh, okay.
That's why we pay for them.
So I would just call to the conference and ask what's available and ask yearly that, okay.
Yep. You can, of course, email me. The other thing you can do is there's a Mission Insight link on our website. And you can link onto that Mission Insight. It gives you the password to log in. They will email me and say, is this an okay person to let in to Mission Insight? Do you know who they are? And I will say yes, and then you'll have access to the whole thing.
Oh, well, see, I thought I was going to find out a way to get Barbara and Patty more busy, but that, I don't know.
Actually, I run them, so you can make me more busy. Okay, I want to talk, anything else you want to know about the Mission Insight reports before we move on a little bit?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm looking at page 15 still.
Yes, ma'am.
And can you explain, I hope this isn't just me, okay, so study area versus US average, when it goes from modestly important to very important, I don't get it. Are they...
Okay, so here's the thing that happens when people answer surveys. They get to say not important at all, somewhat important, moderately important, very important. And that's
some people, these are the percentage of people that
who
said
viewed
modestly
those things.
important or very important. Okay,
Right.
thank
And because it's religious programs and preferences, the religiosity report actually is helpful because it expands that. I think that's, when I do search and call, I send every church that's doing a search a Mission Insight report, executive summary, and a religiosity report. Because I think the religious attitudes are really important. We were talking about church this morning, right? And deconstructing church and reconstructing church and ignoring church. So, all right, I just want to talk about two more things, and then I'm going to turn it back over to Jane. I'm going to ask you to pull that Marks of Faithful Expression of a Healthy Local Church assessment that Kevin mentioned this morning out of your little folder. Y'all know that there are marks for faithful and effective ministers, right? if you've done a profile anytime in the last 6 years, you've had to look at those, whether you were a church or a pastor. The purpose of this document and why the 4 conferences came together to design it is because often we look for the health of pastors, but we don't look at the health of congregations. So a couple things about this document. This is not a document that you just hand to your consistory and say, okay, let's fill this out. They want to understand what the heck you're doing, and if you have a council, they'll be even more confused if you call them a consistory. So this document is based on that same Marks document that we utilize for pastors to measure their own effectiveness. We in no way expect that every church is going to put, we do this, we believe this is who we are on every question. But it enables you to get a feel for how your council, consistory, or congregation think about themselves as having a strong spiritual foundation, for instance. So do they understand and support one another as disciples of Christ? Not a priority some of the time, most of the time, or is it at essence who they are? So these are discussion conversations and questions for you to have with your council or your consistory or your congregation. I've had churches who at the beginning of every council or consistory meeting take one of these categories and look at it and talk about it and assess the congregation on these categories. This can be very threatening to some people. They don't want to have to articulate who they are, or what they believe, or what's important to them, or that there are no leaders, or there's no leadership development going on in your congregation. Therefore, the other document that you have in your little folder is a coaching needs application. How many of you are coaches, trained coaches in this room? All right, see these lovely trained coaches around you? They are individuals who will come and help you do this with your council, consistory, or congregation. So, for instance, if you wanted to have more understanding about how to apply your mission insight, there's a check mark for a mission insight application. How would you use that document in your church? If, in fact, you wanted to look at revitalization, you might want to utilize this healthy expressions as a document for vitality. And a coach can come and help you with that. Now, you will note if you've read the introduction that there are 2 different hourly rates for coaches. One rate is for congregations who donate to our church's wider mission, better known as OCWM. If your church makes a contribution annually to OCWM, you can utilize a coach for $35 an hour. If they do not, the hourly rate is $70 an hour, which is still about half of what a coach outside the church would charge you to do this work with you. If you want this work to be done and you have contributed to OCWM and you still can't afford to do this as a congregation, then you send me a letter that says you can't. Now, we have your budgets, so we will know, right? But if really you are in a spot where at this point your church can't afford to pay for a coach, we will find a way to support you either through our congregational vitality monies, our conference program monies, or my conference minister's discretionary fund. So there are more than one reason to be donating to OCWM. The exception to that hourly rate is if you are in the midst of a search and you need a transition coach to work with you in the search process to help you do the work. Who are we? Who's our neighbor? Who's God calling us to be? We don't charge you for that because search and call is the responsibility of the conference. But if you're not in a search, we ask that you contribute those funds, and you will do an agreement with your coach. The monies will come into us from the invoices that they give you, and we will disperse the monies from our conference office. There's a reason for that. We will track and do a 1099. We don't want you to have to do 1099s for all our coaches. Questions about coaching, about the assessment document, about Mission Insight? Yes?
Are there lists that tell us like who's available for coaching?
I'm so glad you asked who was available for coaching. Michelle Funk, would you stand up? Michelle Funk is the coach coordinator. And if you send in an application for a coach, it will go to Michelle. She has a list of who has training or interest in particular categories. She will identify a potential coach for you. If that person feels like they're not a fit for you, you let us know. We'll identify a second person. It is perfectly okay, just like when search committees interview pastors, for your council or consistory to determine that, yeah, that's not the right person to work with us. Okay? It's okay to do that. Yes, Joel.
I think I'm a pretty bright guy.
She's coming with the microphone.
I was going to say,
There you go.
This is Joel Biggers, and I said I think I'm a pretty bright guy, but and not to be insulting in any way.
No.
Is there wisdom in me just trying to plow through this versus getting a coach? I mean,
sure.
What are the? I mean, some churches are very turned off by having somebody come from the outside. We can do it ourselves, and I'm always kind of stuck between: should I do this myself, or do I get a coach?
So here's my response to you. By all means, you as a trained pastor with a master's degree or equivalent education can look at this assessment and do it with the congregation yourself. Some pastors are uncomfortable with that, and their congregations hear things better from someone who's outside the congregation. Either option is fine. You do not need a coach if you do not want one. If you find that you're trying to have this conversation with your council, consistory, or congregation and it's not getting anywhere, it might be good to have an outside person. But I get it. Sometimes the conference is the big bad wolf, and anybody who's sent from the conference is the big bad wolf. And I understand that. I wish that congregations that feel that way would let us try to come in once and speak with them, but I also know that that's not necessarily going to work. So whatever works best for you, Joel. The document is created so that you can have conversation with them. What we don't want to have happen is it just gets handed out like a survey without conversation. Becky's in the back over here.
We're supposed to be done at 3, Becky.
Okay. I'm a short preacher. Becky Beckwith, I just want to say that as a coach, I think I've been helpful to the pastors because they won't ask questions that they already supposedly know the answer to. Where a coach can come in and ask questions because they're trying to get to know the congregation. And so a lot of times the pastors will hear answers that they are really surprised by. So you're kind of this, unknown entity coming in, and you can ask this really stupid questions, and that's one thing I'm fairly good at.
Yep. Anything else about these 3 documents? Yeah, Steve. Janet's getting her steps in today.
That's right.
Just the question with related to the demographic study. Can you tell us again where some of the interpretation of how to read the report can be found? Because that would be helpful. There's a lot of great things there, but if we don't have a guide for the color coding or what the percentages mean and so on, is there a place where that kind of guidance is available?
Yeah, I would use the links that are on the bottom of the mosaic page, because it will do lots of explaining other than the mosaics. You also can go on the Mission Insight website using our password and our account, and there are a number of other things that you can do. I did predetermined reports for you all, but for instance, if you want to plot where all your members, church members are, somebody can plug in all those addresses. We're not going to do that with the 28,000 members who are in the Penn Northeast Conference, but you could certainly do it with your own church. And there are 6 other reports that you can run. So by all means, look at the website, look at our website, link into Mission Insight, and get as much information as you like from there. Anything else? Cool. I'm going to turn this back over to Jane and Suzanne because they want to talk to you about thriving congregations.
Get out here. I'm trying to remember when it was. Last fall, maybe? Did she? Yes. Yeah. Last fall, each of us got a phone call from the conference minister suggesting that we sign up and attend the Thriving Congregations. So on the screen shortly will be the address that you can, there we go, the Lilly Endowment.org, and you want to look up under that the Thriving Congregations Initiative. It's obviously sponsored by the Pew Foundation, and they're really good at this, Lilly Foundation. And so if you're approved, it's free. So I'll start with that, that if you want to do a part of this as part of your congregation, to do that. I was hesitant at first. Things felt good at Faith, and I was keeping them moving. But I also know, having gone through the process, that at least for my congregation, it was good to have somebody from outside come in. In fact, it was Sue's husband, who's a member of my congregation. We got part way into it, and he says, "This sounds like the stuff that you did for us when we were coming together as 4 congregations." And I said, "Pretty much. But it's different with the outside coming in and teaching us that." So we both said yes, and I'm going to let Sue take it over for what happened after that.
So I have to be honest, and I was not hesitant for it, but my congregation was. I was happy because I'm still relatively new there. Feel like, well, let's put it this way. I started my pastorate there in 2019. Had 4 major funerals my first year there before I even got to know anybody, and then the pandemic hit. So needless to say, I'm still learning about my congregation because it's just been a whirlwind of things, unusual things. So for me, selfishly, I saw this as an opportunity to get to learn about my congregation through the things that they were suggesting. So we met initially in the fall of 2022. It was a large gathering. There were 6 churches involved. 12 consultants came from down south, primarily from the Center for Congregational Health. We were each assigned 2 consultants, each of the churches, and they met with us briefly that evening. That was a Friday evening. Saturday morning, we met again before they all flew out back home. And then I think it worked differently individually. Of course, it was UCC and Lutheran churches that were involved in our area. We had at least 2 to 3, at least a monthly Zoom meeting with them, and then I had more Zoom meetings with the consultants, talking about what we would present when we got the congregation together. My congregation was very skeptical. They don't like having strangers come in, and they were afraid they were going to be told what to do. One of my firmest non-supporters of this was the treasurer of our consistory, who came with me the first night, and thankfully, the 2 consultants that we had were so dynamic that they just won him over. And he made it a point to be at every single meeting from that point on. And so we met and we talked about things like asset mapping. They took us through asset mapping. They actually did that for us in person. We did a lot of questions and storytelling behind the scenes. And then that was with a limited fluid group, people who could make it, who could not make it. And then finally, they were so gracious, they gave up their church obligations on a weekend, came in on a Saturday, met with our consistory. Saturday, we had fellowship in the evening and dinner, and then they worshiped with us on Sunday, and then we caught the whole congregation in a lunch afterwards, which was kind of how I said that's the only way you're going to see our whole congregation. But it worked. You know, we did a whole bunch of asset mapping. We had things up on the walls forever, like the sticky things back there. It was so cool because for Sundays afterwards, even the kids, you know, the few kids that we have would go, "What's that?" And we'd explain it. And they would go, "Well, we have this too." Fine. They'd grab a marker, grab a sticky, and stick it up on the wall. And so it was really cool stuff to see happening. And I don't know if I'm going ahead here, where you want to go. Since then, what has happened is that we have partnered with, we've had people come in from our local groups, because that's another big piece of it, is knowing your neighbor, getting involved with your neighbor, communicating with your neighbor. And so we've had many groups come in and talk about what they do, even though we felt like we knew they were there all along and thought we knew what they did. And now we've been partnering with them to do certain projects in the community. And it has just been really refreshing. And it's been enlivening for our congregation too. It was really good to look at the asset mapping and for our congregation to understand what resources we truly have. So for us, it was an awesome, awesome experience. And I've still been in touch with our 2 consultants. Every now and then we're emailing back and forth, and they're asking how our things are going. And they were very, very dynamic with us. Very intuitive, really good at listening, doing all of the stuff that we're talking about doing with our own congregations. So if you have an opportunity, I would plug for it.
And we had similar but different, I guess you would say, experience with this. I had a team of 6 people, where she had 1. Did you say your initial was the treasurer that came with you? Yeah. So, but that's great. I mean, that's just the way we are. Anyways, they were like, okay, is this going to work? We even had a handicapped person that joined us on Zoom, which was a new experience for all of those consultants because they didn't have to ever deal with that before, but she was great. Anyways, so where did we go from there? We decided the only way to get people in our church is to have food. So we had, for the first time since the pandemic, had covered dishes. And the first one, we announced to the congregation that we were going to honor the past presidents of this. So that got people, the past presidents there, it got their families, and we made a special, I'm not sure, bid to our very small Hispanic community in the church and made sure they were there as a part of it. So, and from that, we had some reporting back to them, what we're doing with this Thriving Congregations at the food thing, covered dish. And we were able to, we didn't do the mapping yet, so we hadn't done that yet, but we were talking about where we thought we were going, but we're not sure. And a lot of that had to deal with, Jane's retiring sometime. I didn't quite announce it then, but it's the idea of what we're going to take into the future. You know, one of the first questions they asked was, and we asked that at the meeting, the covered dish was, you know, what has touched your lives here at Faith in the last, they said 10 years. And And is that something you want to carry into the future? You know, what about that event or that whatever? And that was kind of fun because folks had good memories and they were bringing a lot of stuff up for us. So that was really neat. Then we got done with that, reported back to our coaches. We had 2 coaches from there too. They were both reverend doctors. And so they were senior pastors at their churches. It was kind of a nice mix, if you will. And then we decided we needed to have another cover dish. And of course, all the people were like, oh, yay, we're going to eat again, you know, but you're going to make us work well, you know. And so again, we had another cover dish and that went just as well. In fact, we had more people. We didn't have enough table space set up for the folks. And a lot of that had to do with the enthusiasm of the group that was presenting this to them. I didn't MC it. I didn't do anything but stand there and go, yes, that's right, you know, if they needed that. And that was cool because it was lay-led, and up till then they were used to me grabbing the mic and telling them what was going on. So that was refreshing for them and empowering for them. And I'm going to say part of the results of what has happened being with them for, it was 6 months, I think it was, from November to like May was our last event. We had 3 large events, community events, and actually 4 because I forgot the assets one. The assets one, the group was coming up, our coaches were coming up for us, and we didn't have access to the fellowship hall, and we had to use the sanctuary, and it worked out great, but it was just one of those, this is different, but it was good. But asset mapping. So basically they want to know what are the assets in your congregation. What would you consider to be the assets? And for the most part, not many people mentioned the building, so that was interesting. It's you know, we're still not paid for this building yet, let me just say, but we're getting there. And so, but they didn't mention the building, they mentioned the people. And at one point we were asked to put, you know, the assets on the back doors of the sanctuary there. They're all glass. And a lot of those were just people in the congregation. And even people that had passed, but people they remember as being leaders and moving forward. So it was fun. And I left them on there like they suggested, and like Sue did, and people would say, why is my mom on here? Because she, you know, I said, well, she's one of the assets that we really appreciated, and she's the foundation upon which we stood. So they took us through all those questions. It was sort of a process, and I think it was a little more individualized because different churches, different people, and that was good. And I need to say that to all of you. Don't think you have to be, you know, whatever kind of church to take advantage of this program. It's really individualized, I'm going to say. The outcome has been, as we move forward, for this pastor is going to retire in 13 months. Oh, I'm counting. I was going to say, who's counting? I am. And that's good, and that's a good thing. So I guess questions would be a good thing. Do you have any questions about Thriving Congregations, this program? You're not supposed to sleep, James. Oh, praying for us. Okay, thank you. That's an asset.
I have one real quick. I was looking it up while you were talking about it, and I assume this is still a viable option for all of us, because if you look on the website, it says deadline May 1, 2020. So I just want to make sure this is still... Okay, so...
I think we were in the beginning, weren't we? Because from what our consultants had said to us was that they were going to be looking to do much more of this. So yeah, there's still possibilities for doing this. Yeah. Everybody wants to go home.
Thank you. You're welcome. Does it disappoint you that we're ahead of schedule? Do I need to keep you here till 3 o'clock anyway? No, okay. All right. So the very first thing I want us to do is thank the UCC Greenewalds for all their support. We thank the women in the kitchen and who served us coffee and refreshments all day, and lunch was fabulous, and they set the bar, as I said, for a salad bar at a congregation way high. I also want to thank Kevin McLemore, who came from Pottstown to be with us today. Although he may not still be on Zoom, I want to thank Andrew Warner, who also offered his expertise to us today. And I also want to thank all of you. Ministry Day is a nearly full day experience. And I know how busy your lives are and how hard it is to take a full day out of your work as a pastor and whatever additional work you have if you're bivocational. So I want to thank you for being with us today. And before you leave, there is, of course, a closing worship. It's very brief, but we shouldn't leave without praying in thanksgiving for the day that we've had.
We have prayers for the journey. Could I have my prayers come up? And I have to find my prayer while you're doing that. I'm last, right? Yes. We do have a hymn.
Will you join us in a moment of prayer? Holy, gracious, eternal God, we come to you today grateful for this time of fellowship, learning, and introspection. At times, it's hard to turn our thoughts toward ourselves, to examine the actions of ourselves and our congregations. Today, we have thought about the ways that we may have paused, where we have stalled, and those ways in which we are stuck. God, we ask your help in blessing in finding our way out of the past. We do tend to get stuck there. We also get stuck remembering all of the bad times, bad memories. We're stuck with lots of meetings, but taking no action. Stuck thinking we can only worship on Sunday mornings. Stuck in those power struggles as to who gets to lead the ministry. Help us to move forward, God. Help us to move into our futures with love, compassion, and a vision of the mission you call us to.
Lord, if only we can change even a little bit, if we can stop our complaining and do better at looking for solutions, if we can stop worrying, if we can stop dreaming of the past, if we can stop meetings to discuss without specific actions, if we can stop wishing we could go back to the 1960s, maybe we can pray more. Maybe we can pray more fully. If we can stop our grumbling and look to the future instead of just on paper. If we can start making connections and encouraging families and doing more mission, helping with children's activities and programs. If we can start to have more music programming, maybe music outreach. If we can just change a little bit, Lord, in our ways, help us to grieve what is long gone and stand in hope which is yet to come.
God, you promised to make all things new. And so we pray for that promise to be fulfilled in each of our congregations. We pray, oh God, for the congregations that are struggling. They hire an interim, they reject their leadership, they head to a supply pastors, and then hire another interim. It seems like an unending journey. It's time, oh God, it's time for something new. We give you thanks for the life that we have in each of our congregations. The social hours after church, which are really about that love. Those who are back to birth on that bell curve. Thank you for walking with us. More fellowship. Yes. Again, that community, that connections that we need. The volunteers that we have. Gracious God, they have a good heart, and we need to put them to work. So be with us, helping our folks experience the new and what that means for us. Moving into the new thing that you, oh God, can call us to. Those Kairos moments where some, if there was a Kairos moment in my congregation, I missed it. So we need more. We need Kairos moments. We need Kairos minutes. We need Kairos services, like the bell choir playing. And yes, the energy is still funneled into the food sales, but again, we are meeting some type of community need in that. Gracious God, thank you for calling us to be the church and all that means in each of our settings. And we ask that you continue to walk behind us, pushing us a little bit, walk beside us, shoring us up, and walking ahead of us to show us where it is we need to be going. Open our hearts, open our minds. And we ask this in your name. Let the people say amen. Amen. Benediction, and we have a song. Okay.
I love doing benedictions. Would you all stand, please? Because I love blessing you. We do have a hymn to sing as well, but friends, for you are my friends. We are a church that is called to love, to create love, to nurture love, to spread love, to share love. We are a church that is called to include, to welcome in, to care for, to build community with. We are a church that is empowered by your Spirit. And so as we follow you, our Creator, and you, our Christ, may the Holy Spirit pour down blessings on us. And as we leave this place, may we know that everywhere we walk is sacred ground. Amen.
401.
401.